Let's talk about what makes someone human. Now, obviously, I'm not going to talk about what makes someone evolutionarily human. I mean, what makes uh, one human according to the cultural frame or screen of another society. For instance, why did the Europeans not see the indigenous peoples as fully human, as you can read in the source that revolves around Hans Staden. Another example of a part of society that was not fully human would be women, children, and slaves, all of whom, for various reasons, did not count as fully human. Slaves because they were property, but I should clarify, slaves did not necessarily function as an economic value, at least not in the traditional societies. In non-traditional societies, you see slaves taking on a broader economic function, but in traditional societies, slaves are often linked to status, and as such, they couldn't have status of their own because they were enhancing the status of another. So, for this reason, in a traditional society, a slave was not fully human. In a non-traditional society, because of the economic function of slavery, because they were, a resource to be exploited, they were not to be human either. Children would not be human because they were not yet adults. There were a lot of risks with childhood. Often one would not survive childhood. The infant mortality rate was quite high. Things like that would make children not fully human either. Women were different. Different societies treated women in different ways. Some accorded them more rights and privileges and responsibilities than others. And there were ebbs and flows as to the power of women in society and the privileges accorded to women. You see some ancient societies, like the Greeks, for instance, according women considerably higher status than you see women accorded in later societies, such as medieval Europe. Nonetheless, even in Greek society and even in other societies that accorded women higher value, you don't see women occupying the same status as men. You might see them coming close. You might see women in the elite owning property, having an impact on the elite, that sort of thing, but you never see them at the same status as men. Even female rulers often had to rule largely through men. So because of this, women were not seen as fully human either. Basically, all three of these people did not play a role in the visible encounters, at least not in the traditional sense. But more encounters made more of society visible, and as more encounters spread during this period, as there were more and more cultural encounters, the hidden part of societies became more visible, and those that were not fully human, or not considered fully human, came out in the open as well. And this revelation to the hidden parts of society, so the frames rather than the screens, led to a reevaluation of frames and screens. So you see, fairly early on in American history, in United States history, abolitionist groups questioning the morality of slavery. This is an example of this cultural reevaluation as a reaction to more and lasting cultural encounters. Let's talk about technology. Technology worked as both a impediment to cultural encounters and as a way to spread cultural encounters. The technology itself wasn't as important as the way in which the technology was used. For instance, the Chinese had printing long before the Europeans did, but when the Europeans had printing, one of the first things that was printed was the Bible, which tells you a lot about the cultural frames and screens of Europe at the time. Later, when printing became more widespread, other things could be printed as well, beyond just the Bible. A lot of this early printing obviously focused on religion. Both the Protestants and the Catholics used printing as a way of spreading their ideas during the Protestant Reformation, but nonetheless, as printing became more common, as it worked its way into the non-elite, you see different values being expressed through printing, and you see different cultural frames and screens being projected onto printing as well. So it's not the technology itself, but how the technology is used that has a broader social and cultural impact. This all brings us to the principles and patterns part of the chapter. Um, and and technology, had an impact on the principles and patterns. And you can see that ideas are spread through technology, as well as ideas being hidden through technology. So a lot of the new technology was subversive. And the use of technology relies on the cultural frame in which of the society that's adopting the technology. Remember, the Great Cultural Divide meant that the elites from one hierarchy often had more in common with the elites from another hierarchy as opposed to their own commoners. This ties into the Great Cultural Divide that I talked about earlier, and we're going to see when we see projections of individuality that the elites from one hierarchy are often not that different from the elites of others. And this is one reason why, prior to broader cultural encounters, race played a very small part, because the elites were more concerned with elite status, not necessarily race. All of this adds up to screen images and cultural frames to provide meaning, to provide identity. You often think of identity as something that is not chosen, that your identity is formed over time. But individuals and societies project a conscious identity. Think about it. Whether or not I realize it, every day I project some type of cultural identity. It's fairly obvious. I'll consciously dress or act a certain way in order to be perceived and reacted to a certain way. And most people do the same thing, whether conscious or unconsciously. Why did I choose to set this webcam up so you're facing my books? Obviously, so you're not seeing the rest of my disgusting apartment, but also to project this air of, oh look, I'm your professor, look at all the books behind me, I know what I'm talking about. That was consciously done by me to give this example when I was going to be talking about it. So cultural frames and cultural screens provide meaning, they provide identity. Part of this new identity is individualism. This is a fairly new concept. The idea of the individual was not really present for the late agrarian era. You might have, on occasion, a king or an emperor projecting himself as an individual, but this idea of individuality was mainly, or almost entirely, a fixture of the elite. And you see that in this late agrarian era, this projection of individuality reaching into the sort of sub-elites and even into the non-elites. And this allowed the projection of self as well as projection of the other. You could project yourself as an individual, and you could project your ideas of what made an individual onto others as you viewed them. So we see some examples here of the projection of individualism that was a fixture of this late agrarian era. Toward the end of this period, another example of projecting of individualism was the projection of religious choice, and this was a way to project individualism. One individual making their own choice about religion. This is especially prevalent in Europe, but we're going to talk about other schisms and attempts to mend these schisms coming forward. This is one example of an attempt to mend a schism that created another schism. So this attempt to project individualism that had a broader cultural impact. This is the Francis Xavier, a Jesuit, and this is a Japanese portrait of Francis Xavier, meant to appeal to Japanese Christians. And this created significant problems for the Tokugawa shoguns who are trying to limit Western impact. So you see, the Jesuits were attempting to mend a schism, the religious schism between Catholics and Protestants. And one way to mend this schism was to get new recruits for the Catholic religion. And the best ground to find these new recruits was in Asia. So the Jesuits are very active in Asia. And in doing so, in attempting to mend the Catholic schism, they created another schism in Japanese society. So this projection of European individualism ended up creating a schism, a divide in Japanese society. Another example of a cultural encounter that led to a cultural division or a schism is the noble savage. This is an attempt of Europeans to project a European screen or frame onto an indigenous people. They're projecting the image of a noble European onto the indigenous peoples of the Americas to shape what they thought the Americans were like, not necessarily what the Americans were like themselves. So this is an attempt to stage a European frame on a non-European people. Later, we'll find Marxists co-opting the idea of the noble savage as a way to project Marxism onto non-Marxist people. Marxists, especially Marxist scholars, were trying to prove that Marxism had a longer history than it did. And one way in which they did this was to project the cultural frame of Marxism onto early non-Marxist societies. An example being an indigenous society that didn't have capitalism as we understand it, but had more of a sharing of resources, mostly due to a scarcity of resources. Not necessarily that they didn't have elites, they did, but resources were shared more evenly in non-agrarian societies because of the scarcity of resources and the need to share them. Nonetheless, Marxists used the noble savage as a projection of Marxist ideology onto a non-Marxist people, in the same way in which Europeans projected a European identity onto a non-European people.